In this unit, we're going to ask you to read a little bit of philosophy by Immanuel Kant. This is probably going to be the hardest reading you'll get in the entire course. He was a Prussian-German philosopher in the 18th century, born in 1724. He wrote really difficult text and prose, was not an ideal prose stylist by any means, but he was incredibly important and still is. Probably the third most important philosopher in the tradition after Plato and Aristotle. So we felt it's important to take a look at Kant, also because he has a lot to say about animals and about eating that has been influential in the tradition. So let me say something about Kant the man. He was an interesting character in a way because he was very uninteresting. He was born and grew up in what is now Russia, was then Prussia, in a town called Königsberg. It's now called Kaliningrad. It was given to the Soviet Union after the Second World War and named after Mikhail Kalinin, who was one of Stalin's henchmen, I think. Kant never left Königsberg, or never went further than 50 kilometers from Königsberg. He got some offers to teach in Berlin and elsewhere, and he turned them down and sometimes took lower-level teaching positions just to stay in Königsberg. So he's a man of great regularity and consistency. Every day he would take a walk at the exact same time, and the shopkeepers and the housewives of Königsberg could set their watch by when they saw Kant and his servant Lampe walking past. When it was raining, Kant would refuse to talk to anybody because he thought that opening your mouth when it's raining is liable to make you ill. Lampe would hold an umbrella for him, but he wouldn't greet anybody. Very regular guy, lived into his 80s and worked on philosophy sort of all day, a lot of the time. Did a lot of teaching as well, as you had to in those days. To teach in the system as a Prussian officer, as Kant was, once he became a professor, you become a kind of Beamter, an officer of the state. You would often teach in a sort of military-style dress, and so imagine a kind of 4'10" person, which is about what Kant was, in military-style dress up there lecturing, sometimes wearing the sword that comes with the military-style dress, which might have been 2.5 feet long. So he's up there, this very short guy with a very big sword and a very big book, The Critique of Pure Reason, and proclaiming to his students that they need to learn how to think for themselves. The Critique of Pure Reason, written in 1781, is probably his main contribution, certainly to theoretical philosophy. We can't go into it here, but the main idea is something like, look, the mind contributes something to our experience of the world. We're not just a tabula rasa, not just a blank slate in the way that some of the empiricists thought. We're not able to generate all of these a priori conclusions and speculative metaphysics the way that the preceding rationalists thought, but rather it's kind of a transaction. The mind does bring something to the world, but it's also triggered by experience, and there's a process that goes on, kind of imposition of the mind on whatever the things in themselves are, that results in the empirical world as we experience it. So Kant deduces this through a series of incredibly complicated arguments that scholars still argue about all the time, and in a way is contributing to contemporary movements in linguistics and cognitive science and psychology that take seriously the thought that our minds contribute something really important to the way in which we perceive the world, reality. After he wrote The Critique of Pure Reason, which was about theoretical philosophy, these epistemological and metaphysical issues, he turned to practical issues or moral issues. So he wrote something called The Groundwork or Foundations to the Metaphysics of Morals, from which we'll be reading a little piece in the class, and also The Critique of Practical Reason, and then a few other ethical works, and had a bunch of lectures on ethics, from which we'll also be reading a snippet. So what is practical reason, and how does that differ from theoretical reason? It's not supposed to be mysterious. It's not supposed to be some other part of your brain or some other faculty completely, although he sometimes talks like that. It's just the same ability to consider reasons, be responsive to reasons given from the world, given from your own kind of logical thinking. Reasons, though, not about what exists or what you should think about what exists, or about the nature of the mind and the self and so forth, but rather about what we ought to do. So practical, pragmatic reasons regarding what the right thing to do is in a given situation. So the critique of practical reason adds to the critique of pure reason a whole story about how we as enlightened beings can think through for ourselves a way in which we ought to be without relying on the tutelage of authorities and others who are telling us what to do. So what does it mean to be reasonable? In a way, Kant's injunction is always to be practically and theoretically rational. There's a kind of ambiguity there. There's one sense in which being reasonable just means having reasoning abilities, being able to respond to reasons, so having reason, practical rationality. But there's another sense in which what he means is be reasonable, that is, actually follow your reasons, do what moral or practical reason is telling you to do. And so he associates these two things. You have to have the capacity to reason, you have to have reason in order to be rational, be practically rational. And one of the things we'll see with respect to animals is that he thinks that they just don't have this capacity of reasoning. They have the ability to respond to desires, they have various inclinations, feelings, pains, and pleasures, but they don't have this self-conscious ability to look at considerations that count in favor of doing something or not doing something, and then side intentionally via the will with one of their options because it's the right thing to do. So when we do that, Kant thinks of it as doing our duty, and it gives us a certain kind of moral standing or moral worth. Animals don't have that capacity to reason, and so they don't get to count as having moral worth. They don't have duties, so in a way their lives are easier. They just follow their top desires, but they also don't have this high-level standing, moral worth, moral goodness, practical rationality.